Hello and welcome to this APM webinar, Improving the Effectiveness of Communications. My name is Fran Bodley-Scott and I'll be your host for today. Today's presentation has been organised by the Stakeholder Engagement Focus Group, which is part of the APM People SIG. If you want to share information today on social media, during or after the presentation, we'll be using the hashtag Stakeholder Engagement. So let me tell you a little bit about the Stakeholder Engagement Focus Group first. We all know that stakeholder engagement and communication is important, but there is still this gap between knowing and doing. Poor communication is regularly cited as a root cause for project delays, problems, cost escalation. So a group of practitioners got together to form the SEFG with the aim of focusing more attention across the project management community on stakeholder engagement, what it means in practice and how we might improve the way we go about it. One of our main objectives has been to develop the stakeholder engagement resources on the APM website. Web pages have just been completely redeveloped and relaunched with a wealth of new content that you can now access. But more about that at the end of the webinar. The other focus for us is to share knowledge, tools, methods. There is no definitive answer or best method for doing stakeholder engagement. Each situation is different, but there is much that we can all learn from different industries and different sectors, whether it's private or public sector or not-for-profit. And that's what I'm hoping we'll do today in today's webinar, learning from the approach taken by the Government Communications Service. So that's a little introduction to the SEFG. Let me introduce today's speakers. So this is me, Fran Bodley-Scott. I've been working in marketing communications for about 20 years now. Before that I was an engineer working in product development and manufacturing. My company now specialises in internal and external communications, developing solutions to improve customer relations and stakeholder engagement. I'm a member of the APM People SIG Committee and I'm a member of the SEFG. And with me here today is James Francis. James is kindly stepping in for our advertised speaker, Jessica Pierce, who unfortunately she's been called away at the last minute, is unable to join us. James works with Jessica in Westminster for the Government Communications Service, the GCS. He used to work for the Williams Formula One team, but is now head of the campaigns in the Prime Minister's office and Cabinet office. James is responsible for the success of communications relating to issues of priority for the Prime Minister, and he's been involved in communications challenges such as the Northern Powerhouse campaign, which probably many people have heard of. He also acts as a consultant to government departments to advise on communication strategy to ensure campaigns are effective both in terms of outcomes achieved and also the utilisation of government resources. And that's an important point, that communications effectiveness is not just about getting a message across, it's about understanding the results you want to achieve and using your resources effectively to deliver those outcomes. And hopefully we'll hear more on that today. So James, it's a pleasure to welcome you today. Thank you,
Fran. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for coming along. So before we start, let me explain the format for today. In a moment, I'll hand over to James, who will be speaking for about 30 minutes. We'll pause about halfway through to see if we've got any questions coming in, and we'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to answer any further questions that you may have. The webinar is going to be recorded. The recording will be posted on the APM People SIG community page together with the slides that we'll be presenting today, so you'll have access to those slides afterwards. All attendees are on mute. If you would like to ask a question, it's very easy to do. Just use the question box on the control panel on your screen, type in your question, and we'll answer as many as we can. If we run out of time, then we'll post answers on the APM website afterwards. After the webinar, there will be a survey for participants. Please do respond. Give us your feedback so we know how we can improve next time. And finally, for CPD, you'll need to self-certify 10, and this webinar counts as 1 hour. So without further ado, let me hand over to James. Take it away.
Fran, thank you very much. Again, thank you for having me, everybody. So I thought I'd give you a quick overview of myself. So James Francis, Head of Campaigns in the Prime Minister's Office and Cabinet Office. So what does that really mean? So, well, first things first, it's worth pointing out that I'm a civil servant, running campaigns that are deemed a priority for the given Prime Minister on behalf of the civil service. Now, I point that out because most people see the word campaigns and they immediately think of elections and politics. So I don't do political communications. I don't work for the Conservative Party, for example, or the Labour Party. But what I do is help the Prime Minister of the day, so that would be Theresa May at the moment, achieve her objectives by using communications to help implement policy. Now I have to adapt to change very quickly as part of this role. If a new administration comes in, as we have just seen with the recent general election, for example, the client changes on a whim. So all of the work that we have been doing as a team prior to the general election being called, that manifesto goes out of the window and we're working towards a new remit. So that's part of our challenge. We get a new set of priorities and making sure that we work on communications objectives that will be achieving those policy objectives. And it can be a big challenge for us. You know, the last 2 or 3 months we've had to redraw all of our plans from scratch. How do we do that? How do we respond to those quick changes? Well, we have a system in place in government, which I'll talk through now, called OASIS, which form our campaign activity. It's a nice framework we use, and across the thousands of government communicators, it sets a guiding principle for us to do our work. So I'll run through the OASIS methodology, and I think there's a lot of parallels that can support your work as well as project managers. Now let me move on to talk about the Government Communication Service. We heard Fran introduce that. So when I talk about being part of the civil service, all government communicators are part of GCS. So this is effectively the trade body, if you like, for government communicators. We deal with a massive breadth of activity. We can see on the screen there some examples of some of the campaigns that we've been working on, everything from encouraging people to take up high-speed broadband, stopping radicalisation within our communities, or encouraging investment into the UK. So a really broad range. And the job of my team is to make sure that all campaigns across government are world-class and achieving the objectives that we are setting out. So it's incredibly rewarding work, which is fantastic. As Fran said, my background isn't always in government. I used to work in sports marketing beforehand in the world of Formula One. So I've made a bit of a career change in going into government. But you know, why did I do that? Well, ultimately, everything that we do and all of the policies that we are developing communications around are all about helping and improving people's lives. And it's very rare to have any sort of job where actually everything that you're doing has a nationwide application. So delivering these objectives is absolutely paramount. So let's move on to campaigning now. Now, what is a campaign? This word can be a little bit of a misnomer. Whenever I introduce myself to people, they immediately think I'm working on election campaigns, and I guess many of you may probably think the same too. So let me just kind of unpick that word for you a little bit. We've got a really nice example on the screen here actually of a quote of how we in government define a campaign. We define it as a planned sequence of communications and interactions that use a compelling narrative over time to deliver a defined and measurable outcome. Now, before we did campaigning in government, we did a lot of communications. Okay, we used to send out hundreds of press releases, thousands of tweets, lots of TV adverts. Projects might last from 1 month to a couple of years, and they were successful. But the thing here is, if you're a very busy person, you don't always have the time to be understanding what these individual pieces of communications really mean to you. You've got family lives to dealing with, kids to pick up from school, work commitments, and so on. You don't have the time always to make sense of things being said to you. But if you campaign something, so you have a compelling story told at the right time, in the right way, then people are more likely to take notice. Story is absolutely the key word here, storytelling with a purpose. That's because people are hardwired and conditioned to listen to stories. This goes way back to our childhood. One of the first ever books, the Bible, for example, is written as a story. People are not conditioned to listen to one piece of communications on the radio or understand a press release and understand how that fits into a bigger picture. Okay? So whenever we're doing any piece of communications activity now, we say to ourselves, right, this needs to be a story that has a beginning, has a middle, and it has an end. A lot of our campaign work, therefore, draws very heavily, actually, from traditional storytelling methods that you might see in screenwriting, in films, or in novels as well. Okay. Now, a government campaign, everything we do falls into one of four categories. Okay, we're either trying to get people to start doing something, stop doing something, get them to do more of something, or get them to do less of something. And what we're trying to do is change their behaviour and then measure the effectiveness of getting them to do that. That's at the heart of what we do. And it's relevant to your work, to those joining us today. So take something like Crossrail, for example. If you want people to back the project, okay, some key stakeholder groups, then you need to bring them with you by campaigning your message and your communications. This is getting away from what we tend to call in government SOS communications. Feeling you've done your job by sending out stuff. Okay, sending out stuff randomly is the worst thing you can do. It needs to be brought together in an integrated way, not separate chunks of communication, but a planned sequence of communications over time. So that's an overview of what a campaign is, storytelling with a purpose. Now, in government, we have a framework called OASIS, which is nice and memorable, and this is how we go about planning a campaign. Now, this isn't reinventing the wheel. Many organisations in the marketing and communications sphere have very similar frameworks to this, but we find that this works for us. I'll go through these in stages, but I should point out it's not a linear process. This is something that you will be iterating as you go along the campaign. First things first are objectives. Okay, in government, this is really a policy outcome for the most part. Now, what we're doing is trying to find out what does success look like at the end of the road. So an objective might be, in a government sense, trying to stop young people, for example, from having too much sugar in their diets and trying to cut down on childhood obesity or diabetes. It could be working to get more exporters to invest in UK companies. So we have a clear objective and we work towards what we call SMART objectives. Okay? Every objective in government has to be SMART, and by that we mean specific, measurable, accurate, relevant and timely. Okay, we need to make sure that we have a communications objective off the back of this that we can measure success of the ultimate outcome. Often the minister will come to us and say, I want an advert on TV, or I want an article in a newspaper. But we have to be very clear and challenge them and go back and say, well, what outcome will that deliver ultimately towards achieving your policy objectives, and how does that fit in with the rest of our priorities? Okay. Now you'll see here, so that's absolutely the first key for us when we're doing any of our work. We set down our objectives from day one, and we will put some, normally some KPIs next to those. How are we measuring the effectiveness of communications against achieving policy deliverables? And it can be very challenging. This is something the industry within marketing has challenged with for many, many years. How do you measure the success of communications in achieving an ultimate policy outcome? And I'll come on to that a little bit later on to give you some more examples. So here's an example I've got up on screen now to put a bit of flesh on the bone there. We have an organisational goal, okay, a policy if you like, about getting people to switch their energy provider. So this was a campaign that was run a couple of years ago now, and we wanted to encourage people. If they weren't switching energy providers, people tend to stay with who they have. It's seen as a bit difficult to kind of look into this, but actually you can save a lot of money if you do your research and shop around. So this was the policy objective, to get more people to switch their energy provider and save themselves some money. It's all about the government being seen as supporting people with cost of living and putting more money in their pockets at the end of each month. So we have communications objectives to help support those policy objectives. So we have two listed on the screen there, raising awareness of the benefits of switching energy suppliers and the ease with which people can do that. They weren't aware of how easy it could be. And also secondary to that, promoting the financial savings available if people actually took that step to going out there and trying to switch their energy providers. Okay? Now, once we've set down our policy objectives and then the communications objectives that will support and achieve those, the next stage for us is audience insight. Now, this is really key for us. The narrative is at the heart of any campaign, and every narrator, thinking again back to a screenwriter or an author, every narrator is influenced by their audience. The audience has to be drawn into the story and then be persuaded to engage with it, building their involvement, their commitment, their enthusiasm throughout. This has to be the process, this has to happen for a story to seem relevant to them. And the very presence of an audience ensures you get feedback, which in turn influences the content and the delivery of your story. Think of an actor on a stage. Every night they're constantly updating their performance based on the feedback they're getting from their audience. If you start hearing coughing in the audience as an actor, you know that you need to quickly move to get your audience back on side. So an audience can choose to ignore or dismiss our story at any turn, at any time, so we need to keep them engaged. How do we do this? Well, we use research to understand the current state of our audience, including their values, their fears, their concerns, and this enables us to begin our campaign in ways that are immediately relevant to those we need to influence. It's ensuring we meet them in their world rather than shouting at them from ours. Okay? This means that we begin our story in a place that makes sense to them, in a language and a style that appeals to them. It says we understand and respect you, and it helps create the likability you need to get people to do things for you. A great example with audience insight and where things can go wrong. I won't use a government example for this, but a pizza delivery company recently, they were trying to sell pizzas in the Birmingham area. It's a well-known pizza company, I won't name names. They were trying to shift more products in the Birmingham area, and they decided to do some leaflet drops and other media to promote this. But it wasn't working. And they brought in a consultant and say, well, we've spent all this money on marketing materials and we're not seeing an increase in sales. Why isn't this working? So we did some research. It turns out that their main audience was young Muslim men, and they were doing their advertising push during Ramadan. So no wonder it wasn't working if you're sending lots of advertising through people's doors during that time of the year. So you must always understand your audience. I think a nice quote here from Harper Lee, author of To Kill a Mockingbird. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, so you climb into his skin and walk around inside it. So I'll come on a little bit later on to give you a bit more information around audience insight and exactly how we end up doing that, and a few tricks of the trade. But we can see here we have certain things that we try and achieve in governments with our audience insight. So we ask ourselves these questions: who they are, what do they do, what are they thinking, why they are doing something, and what they're thinking about that at any given time. What's driving their attitudes and behaviour? What are the influences on them? Okay, often they'll have third parties influencing them. Who are those people, and who do we need to get on side to influence? And how can we reach them? Now, there are various sources of insights that we can use in government. Now, there are different types. You can use the higher end of getting audience insights. So this can be a science. You can use qualitative and quantitative means of doing this. Focus groups are one, for example. We like to do those in government, where we'll take a cross-section of the population, sit down with them and say, right, here's an issue. What do you think about it? And we're just trying to generate some understanding. We can do commercial research. We can conduct polling. Again, that's something we often do with our campaigns. Before we start developing our strategy, we'll sit down and say, right, what are people thinking? What is their base level of understanding and knowledge about this subject? Before we try and develop a narrative to address that. However, for the purpose of people listening today, you don't always have to go with the Ferrari option. There are other more simple ways that you can understand your audiences to start developing a strategy that's going to appeal to them. And just simply putting yourself in their shoes, speaking to people down the pub who you know, if you're working on an infrastructure project, and there may be some people in a certain geography who are anti that, and you feel that's the kind of insight you're getting, speak to people who you know are on the other side of the argument to you. Just get out of your own skin and speak to them. Why do they feel this way? Just having a conversation with somebody can be really enlightening. Read the publications that they're reading. That's one thing that we try and do more of in government, rather than always kind of reading the same views of those we agree with. We need to get out of our own headspace. Anything that gives you a different viewpoint. Social media analysis. There are very fancy tools you can use nowadays to understand what people are saying online, but you can search hashtags nice and easily. Anybody can do that on Twitter. So understand what people are saying on the online space. Speak to colleagues in your workplaces. You may have a different opinion to your own. There are many ways where you can start to understand your audience, their thoughts, fears and aspirations. So once we know what our clear objectives are and what we're trying to achieve, and we've got some insights on our audiences, we've identified who they are and what they think about the particular issue and how we're going to get them to change their behaviour or come with us on our journey. The next thing that we need to do is focus on our strategy. But before we do that, and I will turn back to Fran and see if we've got any questions that are coming from our audience.
Yes, let's pause just before we go on. So I just want to, you've covered quite a lot of ground so far. Just want to see if we've got any questions coming in before we race ahead. And just a reminder for everyone listening, if you've got a question, just type it into the question box on the control panel on your screen. So I've actually got a question for you. You've talked about the importance of clarifying the objectives, the outcomes that you need to achieve, and also, more importantly, the importance of understanding the target audience. But those initial assumptions will inevitably change during a campaign, during a life cycle of a project. We've all seen recently how events can completely change people's attitudes, their behaviours. Even when something's going to plan, you talked about Crossrail or something, the project's going well, but the communities are going to change, their understanding of the project is going to change. People start to see a new station coming out of the ground in their backyard. They're going to have very different views of the project. How often do you need to keep going back and checking your audience assumptions? Is a sort of danger, sort of, you spend all your time doing the research and you don't actually do anything. So how do you manage that?
It's a very careful balancing act, and I think one of the challenges that we will always say with our campaigns, one of the key rules we always have, is we try and get our messages in front of our audiences as quickly as possible, while still doing all of the due diligence work. Okay, so it's a careful balancing act there. We will always do the upfront research. Okay, understanding our audiences, where they're at. But you're right, the external world, we're not operating in a vacuum here. So what we will always try and do is, and as a government standard here, certainly at least, it depends, it's very campaign specific, but certainly at least every quarter, ideally for some of the bigger campaigns, at least every month, can be every week on some as well, but at least every month to a quarter. We will consistently go back to our audiences. So the way that we got our insight initially could be through surveys, it could be through focus groups. We will continuously refresh that research every month or every quarter to see whether or not our communications is having an effect and whether or not people's thoughts, feelings and attitudes have changed from where they were previously. That basically means that if you're running a 6-month campaign on a specific issue, the worst thing that you can have is to do your work up front. You think you know where people are at. You run a campaign for 6 months and you can spend a lot of money on that. You get to your end goal and then you realise that actually halfway through there was a big change. Some of the work that I'm doing at the moment is around the economy, and obviously something like Brexit is a big influencer on this, and that can change any second. Any announcements coming out of Brussels, even some comments in the press from somebody from the European Commission or European Parliament can have an impact on people's thoughts towards the economy and the state and health of our economy. So if you continuously go back to your audiences for regular checkups, both to assess campaign performance, but also their levels of knowledge and their perceptions towards your messages, that means that you can have in-flight flexibility with your campaign. And you may find out, actually, you know what, we were talking about the part of the narrative, and I was talking about the narrative journey. Okay, like any good story, you have campaign spikes up and down. You may find out that certain messages, you've covered that, they're not interested anymore, we need to start addressing something else. And if you talk to your audiences on a regular basis, you'll understand, you know what, I now need to focus on this part of my story rather than something you thought of beforehand. So regular check-ins are important. Depends on your budget, obviously. Okay, but I would definitely make sure you're continuously speaking to your audience to get understanding from them.
So there's, we'll take one more question here. So there's a question here that's kind of related to that. How do you filter out representative audience feedback from noise? So how do you know that yes, you listen to your audience?
So when we sit down and look at our audiences, okay, we'll do some very detailed mapping of who they are. Okay, we understand the people we need to be influencing. Okay, and we can drill that down. It depends on the campaign, but sometimes we can drill that down into specific organisations, specific geographies. And so you're right. On the online space, in particular, in the media, you can have a whole range of noise going on. But ultimately, we always identify the exact people that we need to be influencing at any given time and worry about those, rather than what's happening in the ether, because that can make it very confusing for you. So always making sure that you have exactly a firm understanding of who are the people that I need to be speaking to at any given time, and trying to get as specific as you can with that.
Okay. Right, we do have other questions coming in, but I will answer as many as we can at the end. I think at this point, let's, James, you want to move on to strategy?
Yeah, strategy. So once we have come up with our objectives and we've got our audience insights, we take that learning and we develop the strategy. This is decision time. Okay, this is where we are doing such things as refining our messaging, understanding the resources that we have. You know, our campaigns in government, I run campaigns that have no budget whatsoever. There are some that have multi-million-pound budgets. So we understand what channels we can use. Some may be paid-for channels, some may be ones that you're using at low cost, such as the media. We outline any risks that may be impacting our campaign, some third-party external factors that we've just talked about. Outlining any partners, for example, stakeholders that can support us with our campaign as well. Now, so this is effectively writing down how we're going to achieve our objectives. It can be incredibly daunting when you get to this point, staring at a blank piece of paper. Now, the best advice I would give to anybody is just to get something down in writing. Just get jotting down your ideas, and then you can refine them from there. Right, so you've got your strategy. This is your overarching approach, the ideas. You then turn to implementation. This is really the good stuff. This is where you're fleshing out your plan and starting to deliver your work. You know, we're talking about the specifics here. Taking an idea and saying, right, how am I going to actually deliver this? One thing we are very keen on in government is putting this all down onto what we would call a grid. Basically a massive piece of paper where week by week we're plotting out the communications that are going to be reaching our audiences. And again, this makes sure that you're not sending out lots of stuff in one massive burst to people, but you're carefully plotting your story, the beginning, the middle and the end, so that it all starts to tie in nicely and crescendo into a big impact to get people continuing to listen throughout the entire campaign journey. Okay. So if we didn't have the OASIS framework, this is the place where actually you would probably normally start from with any campaign, getting stuff out the door and done. And I think this is where people can start to pull down on communications. It's this need to just be doing stuff, putting tweets out, putting press releases out, but you've done your pre-work beforehand, so you're sending stuff that's actually going to resonate with your audiences. Now, we have a phrase in government, nobody's too big for tactics. Yes, you want to do the big strategic thinking, but everybody should be small enough to do the doing, as it were, the implementation. Nobody's going to take responsibility for delivering your strategy more than you will, because you've spent the time crafting it, you understand the nuances of it. So my message to anybody coming up with a communication strategy is you can't really just delegate it. You have to be there championing its proper implementation. And strategies get out of date very quickly as well, as we've talked about, as the world changes around you. So you need to be there to make sure that you're adapting and responding. You are the mastermind in control of the destiny of your communications plan. At this point as well, again, you think about your audience and the best ways to reach them. So you see on the screen there, where is your audience? You want to speak to them in their own communities. So if, for example, in government, we're trying to encourage more school leavers to take up apprenticeships, we would suggest not to be advertising in the Telegraph. You're not going to be reaching your audience. They're online, they're on their phones, they're on social media. Go where your audience is. Who does your audience trust? Use the people they relate to. Often we find that politicians speaking to certain audiences doesn't resonate. Okay, people don't want to hear from a white middle-class Oxbridge-educated politician on certain issues. So we often go out and say, right, who are influencers in that particular community who agree with what we're trying to do, and get them on board as stakeholders. As Fran mentioned, one of the campaigns that's a priority right now is our Northern Powerhouse campaign. And that's where we are working very carefully to get lots of local stakeholders on board to be championing our campaign on our behalf. That can be business, it can be cultural organisations, for example, and be local sports teams. So we're making sure that people are hearing messages from those that actually will resonate with them. Scoring and evaluation. This is at the end, mainly because OASIS is quite a catchy word and it's nice to have the S at the end there, but actually this is something that we do on an ongoing basis, definitely not just at the end. How do we do this? Well, this comes back to some of the stuff I was talking about earlier around research, quantitative and qualitative. We will always, and again in government we have a minimum best practice of every quarter, but we'll aim for every month for campaigns to be regularly feeding back how they are achieving the KPIs that they have set at the beginning. What might this look like? This might look like in polling, we might want to see a shift of 5%, 10% in people having an awareness of a certain issue. This could be driving people to a campaign website to sign up for something. So we want to see X thousand number of people signing up to our website or visiting our website before the campaign started. So we'll be evaluating the success of how we are getting on with those KPIs, and if we're finding that it's not working, the campaign strategy is not achieving those objectives, then we will go back to the drawing board and we will revisit it and come up with new ideas. You do not want to do that at the end of your campaign and then go, why did this not work? Or there may have been something we could have done, and if only we had changed it 6 months ago, we would have led to a much better result. This is not something that government has always been particularly good at, nor has the communications industry. I think a good example here of the change of Prime Minister from Gordon Brown to David Cameron. We did a lot of reform of government communications during that particular period, and we were under the Brown administration and Tony Blair before that, we were one of the biggest advertisers in the UK, we still are, and we did some really great work. But we were struggling to present back to an incoming administration who had budget cuts on their mind for very good reasons, to say, you know what, we can put some real return on investment figures behind the marketing and communication spend that we have in the pipeline here. We knew it was working, we knew we were managing to change behaviour, but we had no hard data to prove it effectively. And as a quote here from the Executive Director of Government Communications, Alex Aiken, says, evaluation, good, proper evaluation, gives us as communicators the right to speak at the top decision-making level of any organisation. If we can prove that what we're doing is feeding into the bottom line if you're in a private organisation, or is it helping to achieve the change in behaviour that you're looking for? And you can put numbers behind that, then you're onto a winner. So everything in government is now rigorously evaluated, and we monitor the ROI to the taxpayer to make sure it's bringing benefits to society. So whether that's by encouraging people to take out a workplace pension, or stopping somebody to going off to Syria to join ISIS, for example. Everything that we do absolutely has to drive value to the taxpayer. And we can see here, evaluation, it helps us on the accountability front. It helps us to influence future policy direction as well. We understand how to prioritise future spend. For example, there's always this move in the industry around digital being a particularly useful means of reaching our audiences with some of our campaign messages. But how did we actually prove that that was indeed the case? So we now have regular, very sophisticated data coming back to us around some of our digital campaigns, and we are indeed dialing up a lot of our digital spend because it's proving that it is working and is a very cost-effective way of getting our campaign messages out there, as opposed to what we would have done 15, 20 years ago, which is lots of television and lots of radio, which can be a very expensive way of advertising. And we can transfer knowledge as well, so we know what's working well and what isn't, and we can share that very easily with our colleagues across government. But evaluation is really difficult, okay? Comes back to a point I was talking about earlier around government communicators and how, and all communications professionals, are proving that what your communications is doing is ultimately leading to the outcome that you are looking for. It can be challenging in terms of budgets can be tight, so often evaluation can be the last thing that you need to do. You want to get stuff out there in front of your audiences, so setting aside some budget to evaluate your campaign can often be the first thing that you get rid of. There can be a data overload. This can be challenging. And if you get data back around your, particularly your digital campaigns, you see lots of zeros, lots of ones, and it can get very confusing. Expertise in this field can be quite limited as well. Often you are evaluating what we would call outputs rather than outcomes. And I think our next slide talks about that quite neatly. Now, this is the framework we use in government for evaluating campaigns. Okay, traditionally you would look at purely your outputs and your outtakes. Okay, how many press releases did we send? How many people shared our tweet on social media? And if you get lots of high numbers on that, how many media clippings did we have at the end of each month? And normally we would have just stayed at that. But actually, is that leading to the change that we are looking for? Is that influencing the behaviour of our audiences? So now we have a 4-point performance metric test. Okay, you've got your inputs. So what did you do to plan your activity? Okay, your output. So what is delivered to the audience? Okay, this is the reach of your activity. Then you've got your outtakes. What was the audience thinking or feeling and doing off the back of your activity? You know, have you increased the level of awareness? Have you given a greater understanding of something? Have you led to more support for something? And then you have the ultimate outcome. This is the golden egg that you're trying to get to at any point. If you've led to more awareness, led to more understanding, more interest in something, has that taken the final step and led to an influence on your outcome? Okay? Has it changed attitude? Has it changed behaviour? Have you got people doing one of the 4 things I talked about with our campaignings at any time? Doing more, doing less, starting something, stopping something. Okay? So this is how we monitor success of our campaigns. Here's a good example of a campaign I'll talk about. The Great Campaign. Some of you may have seen this. I hope you have. Now, this was off the back of the 2012 Olympics. A great moment in time for the nation. We were widely celebrated, British culture across the world, deemed a highly successful period. And we launched the Great Campaign to capitalise on the momentum of the Olympics. It was basically a bit of a rebranding exercise for the UK, encouraging people to invest, to visit, to study and do business with us. A great example of evaluation. because this campaign can be quite expensive, but we have to deliver return to the taxpayer. So its evaluation metrics are incredibly strong, and they've done a lot of work on this. This campaign, we have managed to prove, has delivered 2.6 billion of benefit to the UK economy to date, with a further 2.7 billion in the pipeline. Okay, it takes all of the various what were disparate activities of the UK abroad. We would have lots of trade missions going on. Embassies around the world would be reaching out to local organisations to encourage them to engage with British companies. We've now created this wraparound umbrella campaign called GREAT, which unifies all of that activity across the world. So rather than having separate events, we bring them together. And we work with businesses around the UK now to profile them as great success stories for the UK and our economy. And the work we've done to build this brand, it's now valued independently at £234 million, and that continues to rise. So when we turn around to the Treasury every year and say, right, we want to continue funding our GREAT campaign, we can turn around and say to them, independently audited figures prove that this is actually leading to 2.6 billion of return to the UK, to the point actually where this is no longer seen as an expenditure by the Treasury, it's actually seen as an investment. So this is a great example of if you can prove the value of your communications, then you'll get buy-in at the very senior level within your organisation. Here's a nice little picture to show some of the great activity, that bloody bus going through Times Square. So hopefully that's given those listening today a bit of an overview of what a campaign is and some of the frameworks that we use in government to bring those to life. A campaign applies to a whole range of different disciplines. People often think it's PR, it's about kind of improving the reputation of something, but actually no, it's a lot more complex than that. It's about if you want somebody to do something for you, or if you need to change somebody's opinion on something, then using a campaign approach to do that, to time all of your communications together and telling a compelling story over time and monitoring the success of that, and then having clear objectives, which you can always tie back to, can lead to the success that you need. So yes, I'll open up to any questions at this point.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. And yes, we do have quite a lot of questions coming in. And I'm going to start sort of at the end actually, because it's interesting the great campaign that you were talking about. One of the questions here is, what's the most effective performance metric? And it just struck me that you've been talking about effective communications, which is around the outcomes of your campaign, but actually that metric that you were using for the GREAT campaign is actually an ROI one. That's the one that you feed back to. So, you know, how would you, what would a good performance metric be? How do you choose your performance metric?
How do you choose it? It depends on the sort of change that you're looking to get with your campaign, okay? We tend to have, I'd almost split this up into two, okay? So you can have very specific objectives for a campaign. You're getting somebody to physically do something, or so to give you some good examples, we may be trying to do an awareness campaign, okay? So some of our campaigns will be classed as public information awareness campaigns. So at that point, the best means of getting people, of understanding how you're influencing your audiences can be based around polling to understand how many people are engaging with your content. So often one of the favourite things we like to do in government is create information points where people can access more knowledge. So this could be dedicated websites that we set up to get people understanding how to set up a workplace pension, the benefits of that. It could be a dedicated website for encouraging people to learn more about how they can change energy providers. So one of the key campaign metrics we'll work towards there is regularly finding out from a key selection of audiences of what levels of awareness do they have of our campaign messages, and has that led to an increase in people taking up offers to find out more information. So if I was running that campaign, I'd be doing some polling with people to understand, you know, where were they understanding the issue at hand beforehand. Probably be quite a low benchmark. You know, what were they thinking about a workplace pension? You might have quite a low figure. How have you managed to change awareness levels about that over a period of time? You want to see a strong increase in people understanding not only your campaign messages, but also the thoughts and feelings around the benefits of a workplace pension. And then the most value you can have there is, how has that led to somebody actually taking action? okay, so then you can do some driving of metrics around your campaign spikes of activity, of how many people have then been visiting your website, or how many people have been ringing up a particular office, for example, to find out more information. So then you can link your activity and awareness levels to how many people are actually taking action.
There are some questions here on the same theme of dealing or running a campaign with a very diverse audience base. And so Hayley here is saying that she manages the email service across the whole of the NHS. The user base is very varied in terms of locations, skills, requirements, knowledge, etc. Have you got any advice about planning and carrying out an effective communications across a broad user base?
That's a very good question, and I think it largely depends on what resources you have. So a good example of this actually would be some of the regional campaigns I run, so Midlands Engine or Northern Powerhouse, where again we have very wide stakeholders, a range of industries, big business to small business to individuals. So what we tend to do is segment the audiences and segment the channels that we use to communicate with them, because having a one-size-fits-all approach will never be ideal for this. So I appreciate you may have one generic newsletter or magazine, what have you, for the NHS that you're sending out. My challenge back to that would be actually, again, it can be a budget issue, but are you able to actually have more specific, you may want to continue with one umbrella approach, but can you actually segment that a little bit more for your audiences? So that's what we do with our economy campaigns. We will actually send out dedicated communications for a general public audience, because actually what we know works with them is not finding out about investment statistics. You know, people don't really care about that. They want it to be completely localized to them. They want to understand stories about how investment in their region is going to impact them on the school run, their journey to work, by getting a job, or their children going to have a better, brighter economic future. Is it easier to grow a business nowadays in that region? So we tend to focus on hyper-local stories, only with very local case studies. And we will tend to use engaging digital content to tell those stories, Facebook and Twitter. Whereas if I'm wanting to also reach out to a business audience, business owners, and big business or SMEs, I don't tend to use that same approach. I will be using more traditional methods, so I will do some face-to-face stakeholder events, for example. I tend to use government spokespeople. I have a magazine I send out on a regular basis to those audiences with fellow CEOs acting as mouthpieces. So I carefully understand my audiences. I do some research to understand what kind of things they would like to see and will resonate with them. I will try and then create different communications moments for those audiences. So my challenge back would be, are you able to do that? Are you able to segment some of the communications you're sending out? If you are not and you have a challenge there, then try and make sure that you have something in the communications you're sending out that can appeal to the broad range of audiences rather than just focusing on one specific one.
Okay. There's a question here which is about maybe the campaign message is going to change direction. So someone's asked here about, use the example of HS2, how do you change the direction of a campaign, which is possibly around the messaging, suggesting the messaging for HS2 changed from the imperative of speed to capacity. So where you've got research that's coming back saying, well, hang on, the circumstance, the environment's changed. Yeah. How do you manage that shift?
This is a very apt question, because we're, again, with the new government coming on board, this is something that we're doing as we speak at the moment, with shifting some of our narratives in a new direction. I think one thing I would always say is you want it to appear as subtle as possible with your audiences. Nobody likes a flip-flopper, it doesn't look very good. So what you need to do is have that, when you're looking at your story, okay, you need to plot out a careful shift in that narrative over time. So you don't want a hard and fast chop between what was said before and after, okay? You want to, if you're in it, it can sometimes be controversial, There may be good reasons why your narrative have had to change. It could have been because of a mistake. It could have been because of a third-party intervention or something that's been completely unexpected. So as soon as you have sight of an impending change, you need to then start adjusting your strategy so that you can carefully, over a series of time, it can be weeks, it can be months, you start shifting your narrative into a new direction so it looks almost seamless, rather than, I guess it's almost ripping the band-aid off slowly rather than a kind of a quick, sharp change, because what we tend to find there is people get a little bit confused and mistrusting if they find all of a sudden you're speaking about something completely different. So you need to then work carefully to seed in your new messaging and turn your ship around in a slightly slower means than going about for a quick turn around the corner. Using some of my old Formula 1 analogy then.
There's a couple of questions here about budget. I get the feeling someone's had possibly the budget from underneath them. What do you say if the budget won't allow you to produce a good communication project, but the client still wants you to do everything with half the funds available or whatever? So how do you manage that?
That's a good question. I think, funny enough, my background prior to working in government has traditionally been in public relations and effectively working with little to no money. So I can give you a good perspective on this. I think there's two ways. You can do an awful lot in communications nowadays without having any money. You just tend to go for an earned and owned approach, as we would call it, rather than paid for activity. So look at using cost-effective channels. So that can be setting up your own social media channels, if you don't have those already. A Twitter, a Facebook, a LinkedIn, an Instagram. It doesn't cost any money to set these things up. And you can start putting out some quite engaging content that can be free. So there are tools online, for example, where you can create things like compelling infographics or GIFs and things like that to help tell your story to audiences. And also working with the media. The media is still a very powerful voice for any communication, and obviously it is a free tool for you to use. If you're able to package your story in a compelling way where a news editor is going to find that interesting, then you can generate a lot of free media coverage off of the back of that. Don't always rely on trying to spend money at the first port of call. This is what we tend to do with government. We look first and say, can we do this for free? Is our story compelling enough? Can we package it in such a way and treat the media as one of your key audience targets? If you can package your story in such a way that actually it's newsworthy, it's timely for a journalist, then you can get media coverage which directly impacts your audiences. If you've got a campaign, for example, that you're trying to influence people within your own industry, it could be a fellow engineer, for example. Now, you could organise an expensive event or something like that, but ultimately you might turn and say, actually, there's a lot of trade magazines. I'm sitting in the IET's office today. They have a very good one, Engineering Technology, so you may want to use some of the trade magazines to reach out to your audience and get your story across. That's free. If you can package your story in a very compelling way, then you might get interest from an editor at the magazine, and then there you go, you've got an outlet for your story. The second means for this as well, I would highly recommend, is partnership activity. This is something we're trying to do more of in government as we speak, and it ties back into my points around often getting the right third party to deliver your message can be more powerful than you just saying it yourself. So don't have any money, turn around and say, well, who are the sort of organisations or people who are going to be supporting of what I'm trying to achieve? From a government perspective, we may turn around and say, we're trying to cut childhood obesity. Well, actually, there's an awful lot of pharmacies, for example, or there can be some sporting organisations who also share that objective as well. So how can we get them on board to support what we're doing and use their resource and their own channels to back our campaign? If they can see a return for them at the end of the day and they support your objectives, reach out to them and say, you know what, I have got some content, I've got some low-grade stuff, but I don't have the budget to do anything more. Can they help in any way? It could just be an amplification job. They may offer to put some posters up in their reception or do some sharing of some of your social media content, or they may turn around and go, you know what, I really support this idea, therefore I want to support you, and then they put some budget behind that. That's one thing we're doing with a lot of our campaigns. Again, I've talked about Northern Powerhouse as an example. I've traditionally had no budget to run that campaign. But what I do is I get lots of local stakeholders on board who really champion and support the Northern Powerhouse concept, and they turn around and say, you know what, I want to run with this. And they can support our campaign, and we empower them to do that. So think about earned and owned channels and PR, but also think about any partners you can bring on board to support your work.
Okay, well, we do have a lot of questions. I'm going to take one more here, and it's a simple one, but probably gets the essence of this. Once you have your plan, how do you make the transition from the plan to actually implementing it? The question is, what's the first step? To run the whole thing, what's the first step? You've got your plan, how do you kick off the implementation?
So the best, and I referenced this earlier, is coming up with what we call a campaign grid. Okay, that is always the first stage of implementation. So your strategy is the top level. Okay, it's the message, it's understanding how you're going to reach your audiences. So you're talking about the channels you're going to be using, the story you're telling, the timings you're doing that. The first way to really flesh that out into action is to come up with a campaign grid. So, and this is becoming pretty common practice across the industry now. So I would sit down and I'd say, right, I understand my budget, I understand what I'm going to be doing in terms of the audiences and the channels, and do a week by week, blow by blow account of the certain things you're going to be doing. Okay, so, and then that comes back to this point around telling your story over time. If you come up with a campaign grid, and you set that out and say, right, okay, what am I going to be doing around these different channels, and plot that down, and just start populating that grid with all of the different things you could be doing. Okay, it could be, might be organising some events, you might be putting out some press notices, you may be putting out newsletters or magazines. Start populating all of the various things you can do onto one big spreadsheet or one big chart, and then you start to play around with it. You start to say, right, I'm going to do that on this week, I'm going to do that on this week. Make sure these things aren't clashing. Make sure you're not doing too much in one go. Make sure there's no big gap in air time for months and months or weeks and weeks. And as soon as you've got your grid, this is the first stage we use in government, we then start to play around with that and massage it, and it all starts to bring it to life, and you start to see what you're going to be doing on a week-by-week basis. So I highly recommend plotting that down on a week-to-week or month-by-month basis, and playing around with it so you can really start to bring it to life.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, James. We are getting close to the end of nearly out of time. So thank you everyone for your questions. Where we can, we'll try and get answers to you on the APM website, but thank you for putting your questions in. But just before we close, just got some information. So I think a couple of people are asking if the OASIS information is available. Yes, I've got some links for you here. And so you'll get a copy of these slides afterwards, so you don't need to jot these links down. But if you go to the GCS website, the OASIS campaigns guide, which you can download, and there's also a guide to evaluation of the framework, and there's some guidance there on the GCS website, so you've got the links there. I've also put up there's something called the ABCD model. It's very similar to OASIS. I think James said at the beginning that OASIS is not unique. There are a number of models. ABCD is something that I've used for many years. I have no idea where it originated from, but it's something that I use in my communications work. And my experience of these sort of frameworks is they do deliver a lot of benefits in terms of structure and the way you think through a campaign or a communications plan, and just make it more predictable. I've just put some information there. That's my website, so I've just put some information on there that you can go and take a look at. Also, I'd just say there's more general information about stakeholder engagement. Someone else has asked a question about behaviour analysis and theory, and I know it's something that James wanted to touch on. We've run out of time, unfortunately. But there is more information about stakeholder engagement at the broad spectrum, or the 10 principles of stakeholder engagement on the APM website. As I said at the beginning, this is a completely new set of resources. Even if you've been on the website recently, we've relaunched it on Friday, so there's a whole load of new information there. Go and take a look, and you hopefully will find some more information about communication, and more tools, techniques, case studies about how to do stakeholder engagement. There are some events coming up. Quick bit of advertisement for people's sake. Got 3 events coming up where you might find, again, some answers and some information that will help you with your stakeholder engagement and communication challenges. 20th of July, Milton Keynes. There's a presentation, The Leadership Challenge, Is It Easy to Identify Good Leaders? End of September, early October, People FIG's doing a knowledge workshop. It's going to be a half-day event, probably in London, but we'll finalise the date and the venue and advise you shortly on where that's going to be. And the next one on here is on the 10th of October in Macclesfield, about collaborating, influencing and conflict management. And so 3 events there. Actually, that last one, if you book now, you'll get a saving of 20%. So for all information about all these events, go onto the APM website. You've got the link there, apm.org.uk/events, where you can register for these events and find out some more information about good practice. Finally, if you want to get in touch about any of the points that we've been talking about today, here are our contact details, so please do get in touch. It just remains for me to say thank you, James. On behalf of everyone listening today, I want to thank our speaker, James Francis. It's been a really interesting presentation. You've shared a lot of practical tips and advice that hopefully people can put into practice now, so many thanks indeed.
It's my pleasure, thank you for having me.
And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Do get in touch if you've got any further questions. You can contact us through the People FIG page or directly, as we've got the contact details there. I do hope this has been useful. The slides and recording will be posted on the APM webpage. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you and goodbye.